A girl moves on her hands and knees across a roof of black ice. 30 below, a pole in her frozen fist swinging at something the dark won't let her see. Below her, a cabin pours smoke from every seam. 14 miles from the nearest road. No phone, no help coming, and no one alive who knows she's up here, except someone has been. The porch was swept, the woodpile freshly split, boot prints crossing a floor that should have held 53 years of dust. She bought this place for $10. The county called it condemned. The Forest Service called it empty. They were wrong about empty, because behind a locked steel cabinet sealed, since the winter, a man vanished. Something has been waiting for her. I should flag something briefly, then get to your task. The safety note that came through doesn't fit this conversation. We've been doing fiction editing the whole way, and Elias's death in the story is handled as off-page grief, no method or detail. So there's nothing here I need to redirect. If you're ever working through something heavy yourself, I'm glad to listen, but I don't read anything like that in your messages. On to the work. Here's the full corrected story, integrated end to end. I fixed Walt's age, changed the rescue year, so his age lands in his 70s, clarified that Margaret was the baby given away in 1956, trimmed the alone versus lonely and cabin repair repetitions, removed the meta line, and tightened the ending into a single clean close. She was 21 years old and homeless. No family, no savings, just $10 folded into the bottom of a backpack she had been living out of for 3 months. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned ranger station deep in the mountains of Idaho, a place so remote the nearest paved road was 14 miles away. The Forest Service said it was unsafe. The county said it had been condemned for decades. But what nobody knew, what nobody could have known, was that locked inside that old cabin, in a sealed metal cabinet that had not been opened in 53 years, was something that would change her life forever. This is the story of Maren Voss, and it does not begin in the mountains. It begins on a kitchen floor in Spokane, Washington, 13 years before she ever set foot in that cabin. She was 8 years old the first time her mother found her there, cross-legged on the cold linoleum, an old road atlas spread open across her lap. The atlas was worn soft at the corners, its spine cracked, its pages smelling of dust and gasoline and something faintly sweet that Maren could never name. It had belonged to her grandfather, a man she had never met, a man nobody ever talked about. Her mother stood in the doorway with a coffee cup going cold in her hands, watching her daughter drag one small finger across the green spaces on the map, the national forests, the wilderness areas, the places that belonged to no one. "What are you doing, baby?" her mother asked. Maren did not look up. "Looking at where I'm gonna live someday." Her mother smiled, shook her head, and went back to whatever she had been doing, because she thought it was a phase, a thing children grow out of. It was not a phase. Her name was Lorna, and she raised Maren alone, in a small rented house on a quiet street in a suburb where nothing ever happened, where the lawns were always cut, the cars always washed, and the neighbors waved but never came inside. Lorna worked as a bookkeeper at a feed store outside of town. She believed in things she could count, things she could verify. She was careful with money she did not have and careful with hope she could not afford. Maren's father had left when she was 4. She did not remember him, not his face, not his voice, not whether he had ever held her or sung to her or read her a single word before sleep. All she knew was that he had been there, and then he was not. And her mother only said one thing about him ever: some people aren't built for staying. Maren understood that. Even as a child, she wondered, sometimes lying awake at night, whether she was one of them, because she could not sit still, could not stay inside the lines. She was good in school, but bored. She finished her homework in 15 minutes and then sat at her desk staring out the window. at the row of identical houses across the street, wondering what was beyond them, beyond the edge of town, beyond the edge of the state, beyond the farthest road on any map she had ever held. She read everything she could find about people who walked into the wilderness and did not come back, trappers, explorers, people who built cabins miles from anyone and lived there alone with the silence. She started camping by herself at 14, took the bus to the trailhead with borrowed gear, and walked into the mountains for 3 days at a time. She learned to read a topographic map, to filter water from a stream, to tell the berry that fed you from the one that killed you, to start a fire in the rain, to hang her food so the bears could not reach it, to find her way by the stars when the trail simply disappeared beneath the snow. Her mother did not approve, but her mother also did not know how to stop her, because arguing with Marin was like arguing with weather. You could complain all you wanted. It was going to do what it was going to do, and the only thing you got to decide was whether you brought an umbrella. By 17, she had hiked over 800 miles, mostly alone, mostly off-trail. She knew those mountains the way some people know the streets of the town they grew up in, which passes melted out early, which ones held snow until July, where the water ran cleanest, where you could stand on a ridge and see 50 miles in every direction and not one single human being. The mountains were the only place she ever felt like herself, the only place she ever felt like she belonged. And then her mother got sick. It was March, the year Marin turned 19. Lorna had been complaining about her stomach for weeks. She thought it was an ulcer. She thought it was stress. She thought it was the burnt coffee at the feed store that always tasted like it had been brewed in a tin can. The doctor said pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 6 weeks. That was all they got, 6 weeks. Marin was there at the end. She sat beside the hospital bed and held her mother's hand and listened to each breath come a little shallower than the one before, each exhale a little longer, until there was an exhale that did not have an inhale after it, and the room went quiet, and Marin was alone, completely alone, because Lorna had been her only family, and Marin had been Lorna's. There were no siblings, no aunts, no cousins who sent cards at Christmas, no grandparents she had ever known, just the two of them, mother and daughter, in a quiet house on a quiet street in a suburb where nothing ever happened. And now there was just Marin. After the funeral, she went back to pack, but there was nothing to pack. The house was rented. The car had been repossessed during the medical leave. The savings, what little there had ever been, was gone, swallowed by hospital bills and hospice care and all the small, terrible expenses that pile up when someone is dying and nobody is working. Marin stood in the empty living room and looked at the walls that had held her whole childhood, the carpet where she used to spread the atlas, the window where she used to watch the houses across the street, the kitchen where her mother had once found her tracing green spaces with her finger and smiled and shaken her head and thought it was a phase. She had $400 to her name. She did not know what she was going to do, but she knew it would involve mountains. It always did. For 2 years she lived like a ghost. She picked apples in the fall, sleeping in a tent at the edge of the orchard beside seasonal workers twice her age, people with stories they did not want to tell. She washed dishes at a backpacker hostel, trading labor for a bunk in a room with 7 strangers who came and went like weather. She did 1 summer of trail crew for the Forest Service, and that was the closest thing to heaven she had ever known. Long days in the high country with an axe in her hands, building water bars, clearing deadfall, sleeping 3 miles from the nearest road. The pay was almost nothing. She would have done it for free, but seasonal work ends when the season does. The harvest finished. The hostel cut staff for winter. The trail crew disbanded in September and would not gather again until spring. And Marin drifted from couch to bus station to hostel bunk, always moving, never staying, carrying everything she owned on her back. By 21, she had been in motion for almost 2 years, And she was tired. Not tired of the mountains, never that. Tired of being between them. Tired of bus stations and library computers and the smell of other people's laundry. Tired of waking somewhere new every week and never knowing where she would sleep the next. She wanted somewhere to set the bag down. Not an apartment, not a lease, not a credit check or a rental application or a room in someone else's house where she had to ask permission to use the stove. She wanted somewhere remote, somewhere difficult, somewhere hers, somewhere nobody else wanted, because the things nobody else wanted were the only things she could afford. She found the listing in February on a library computer in Coeur d'Alene, scrolling through Forest Service surplus property pages while the rain came down outside. The government sometimes sold off old buildings it no longer needed, fire lookouts, work camps, ranger stations. Most had been auctioned years ago to people who wanted a weekend cabin or a story to tell at dinner. But some just sat there in legal limbo, too small, too remote, too tangled in old restrictions to ever draw a bidder. The one Marin found was an old district ranger station in central Idaho, used as an outpost from 1927 until 1971, then closed when the service consolidated and left empty ever since. 53 years of emptiness, 53 years of dust and snow and silence, and no one there to see it. The county had been trying to sell it at tax auction since 2008, with no luck. The asking price was $10. Marin stared at the screen. $10. She read it again, looking for the catch, because there is always a catch. Nothing costs $10 unless something is very, very wrong with it. The catch was the access. 14 miles from the nearest paved road, 8 of those on a Forest Service road closed by snow from October to June. The last 6 on a foot trail that climbed over a 7,200-foot pass. No electricity, no water, no phone, no way in during winter except on foot or on skis. The nearest town was Stanley, Idaho. Population a little over 100. Marin looked at that listing for a long time. Then she opened a topographic map of the area, and she found it. A small blue square in a sea of green forest and brown contour lines. She traced the trails that led to it, measured the distances, calculated the climb, found where the creeks ran, where the ridges would block the wind, where the south-facing slope would catch the most sun. And she looked at all that empty space around it, miles of it. No roads, no houses, no power lines, no towers, just mountains. 2 weeks later, she was standing at the trailhead. The bus had dropped her in Stanley a little after noon, and Stanley was barely a town at all. A main street, a general store, a gas station, a diner, a handful of houses scattered along the road like dropped change. Behind it all, the Sawtooth Mountains stood up like a wall of stone, their peaks still heavy with the last of the winter snow. Marin went into the diner because she did not know when she would eat hot food again. The woman behind the counter ran the place by herself, somewhere in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a long braid, hands that looked like they had worked every single day of her life. Her name was Della Hayes. She looked at Marin's pack, at her boots, at the map spread out beside her plate, and she set down a coffee that Marin had not ordered. "You headed somewhere, honey," Marin told her. Della's eyebrows went up. "That old Crane station." She said it slow, like the name tasted of something. "Nobody's been up there in years." Marin asked what she meant. Della wiped the counter, took her time. "Belonged to a ranger named Elias Crane. He was up there 13 years. Then one winter, the winter of 71, he just stopped coming down." Marin waited. "They said he transferred to Alaska." Della shook her head slowly. "Paperwork said it. But I was a young woman then, new to this town, and I'll tell you what I remember. I remember the search parties. I remember the dogs. I remember men coming back off that mountain with frost in their beards and nothing in their eyes. She set the coffee pot down. They never found him, never found a thing. Marin's cheeseburger arrived. She did not touch it yet. "You knew him?" she asked. Della went very still, and something crossed her face, something old, something she had carried a long time. "A little," she said. "He came down for coffee, once a month maybe. Quiet man, read a lot, didn't waste words." She turned the rag over in her hands. "Last time I saw him, the fall before he disappeared, he was sitting right where you're sitting now, and he said something funny, something I never forgot." Marin leaned in. "He said he had a little girl somewhere down in Spokane, a daughter he'd never get to know." Della's voice dropped. "Said it the way a man says a thing he's already made peace with. Then he paid for his coffee, and he walked back up that trail, and I never saw him again." The diner was quiet. Somewhere a clock ticked. Marin did not know why her chest had gone tight, did not know why the word Spokane was sitting in her stomach like a swallowed stone, because Spokane was where she was from, because everyone is from somewhere, because it meant nothing. It had to mean nothing, except it would not let her go. "Eat your food, honey," Della said gently. "Long walk ahead of you." After lunch, she caught a ride to the trailhead with a Forest Service man who was driving out to check a work site. He was older than he looked, somewhere in his 70s, white beard, skin dark from the sun, the quiet way of a person who had spent more of his life in the trees than out of them. His name was Walt Brennan. They did not talk much. Walt was not the talking kind. He drove a green truck with mud on the fenders and a cracked windshield and a faded sticker on the bumper that said "Leave no trace." But when they reached the place where the pavement ended and the forest road began, he pulled over, and he looked at her gear, at her boots, at the way she had shouldered her pack without once adjusting the straps, like she had done it 10,000 times. "You know what you're doing," he said. It was not a question. "I do," she said. He nodded slow, looked out at the mountains, and for a moment he seemed to be somewhere else entirely, some year a long way back. "That station you're going to," he said. "You be careful up there." "I will." "No." He turned and looked right at her, and his eyes were wet at the edges, though the rest of his face gave nothing away. "I mean it. That place. It chooses people. I've watched it my whole life. It chooses." Marin did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She got out, shouldered her pack, and started walking. And Walt sat in that truck a long time after she had gone, watching the trail where she had disappeared into the trees, because Walt Brennan knew that mountain better than any living soul, because Walt Brennan had been keeping a promise for 53 years, and he had not told a single person what it was. The forest road climbed slow through lodgepole, pine, and aspen, switchbacking up the long side of a valley. The snow had melted off the road, but lay still in dirty patches in the shade, the last gray remnants of a hard winter giving up its grip. Marin walked at 1.5 miles an hour, the pace she had learned on the trail crew, the pace you can hold all day without breaking. She passed 2 creek crossings on old log bridges, stopped at each one to filter water and rest her shoulders and listen to the sound of it running over the stones. She passed an old burn, the dead trees standing silver against the sky, bark stripped away, branches broken off, only the trunks left, but at their feet new growth, small pines, wildflowers, grass reaching up for the light those dead trees had finally let through, because the mountains were always doing this, burning down, growing back, dying, and being born again. She made camp that night at the base of the pass, in a small flat clearing beside a half-frozen creek, set up her tent, cooked rice and beans on her little stove, and ate it watching the stars come out one at a time. First the bright ones, the planets low on the horizon, then the dim ones filling in the dark like someone turning on lights in a vast and empty house, the Milky Way rising, a river of light from one edge of the world to the other, and Marin tilted her head back and felt the thing she always felt when she looked at the night sky, small and temporary and unimportant, but part of something, part of all of it. It went below freezing by midnight, but cold did not scare her. She slept the deep, heavy sleep of a body that had worked all day and was grateful for the rest. When she woke, frost lay thick on the outside of her bag. Her breath made clouds in the dark, and the eastern sky was the color of pale rose behind the granite ridge. She packed up, and she climbed. The trail to the pass was steep, north-facing, still holding deep snow in the shaded places. In some spots she had to kick steps into the crust. In others the snow had melted and refrozen to ice, and she had to move slow, testing each step before she gave it her weight. The pass sat at 7,200 feet, a narrow gap between two granite peaks, a place where the wind never stopped. She reached it breathing hard, legs burning, sweat soaked through her base layer despite the cold, and she turned around and looked back the way she had come. Mountains, nothing but mountains, the valley below her a green ribbon, the creek a silver thread winding through it, beyond it more ridges, more peaks, more wilderness running out to a horizon so clean it looked drawn with a knife. Then she turned and looked the other way, a different valley, broader, full of pine and aspen, and the aspens were just beginning to leaf out, a pale, brilliant green against the dark conifers, like thousands of small lanterns held up against the shadow. And somewhere down there, invisible from where she stood, was the cabin, her cabin, the place she had been looking at on maps since she was 8 years old. She started down. The descent was kinder than the climb, south-facing, less snow, the trail winding down through meadows where the first wildflowers of the season were already coming up through the melting white. Glacier lilies' yellow petals bent back like wings, spring beauties pink-striped and small. By mid-afternoon, she was walking through lodgepole, the trees tall and straight, bare for the first 20 feet of trunk the way lodgepoles grow, reaching, competing, climbing for the light. She crossed one more creek on a log bridge that looked like it had not been touched in 50 years, tested it with her heel, felt it give, but hold. She climbed a small ridge, and then she saw it. The cabin sat in a clearing on a flat shelf of land above the creek, dark-stained logs, a steep green metal roof built to shed snow, a small covered porch on the south side, a stone chimney rising from the west wall, a faded brown door, and, behind it, half hidden in the trees, a fire lookout tower, 60 feet tall, leaning just slightly, still standing, still watching the valley the way it had watched for almost 100 years. Marin stood at the edge of the clearing and did not move. The light was the color of old copper. A cold breeze came down off the ridge and moved through the treetops and made them sway, slow, gentle, like they were nodding to her. Somewhere far off a raven called. The sound carried impossibly far in the thin mountain air. This was it. This was the place she had traced with one small finger on a kitchen floor 13 years ago, the place her mother had thought was a phase. It was not a phase. She walked across the clearing. The winter grass was tall and brown, but under it she could still see a path, worn into the ground, a path walked thousands of times by the man who had lived here before her, the man named Elias Crane, who had vanished in the winter of 1971 and had never been found. She climbed the porch steps. The boards creaked under her boots, and then she stopped because something was wrong. The door was locked, old and soft, with rot at the edges, but locked. That was expected. What was not expected was the porch, because there were no leaves on it. 53 years, and not a single drift of pine needles or dead leaves in the corners. The boards were swept. Recently, she could see the faint arc of a broom in the dust at the threshold. She turned, slow, and she saw the woodpile beside the porch, lodgepole split and stacked in a neat row, and the cut ends were pale, fresh. This wood had been split within the year. Marin's heart began to beat hard against her ribs, because somebody had been here, because somebody was still coming here, to a cabin 14 miles from the nearest road, to a place that the Forest Service swore was empty, that the county swore was condemned, that no map in the last 50 years even bothered to mark. Somebody had been caring for it. She put her shoulder against the door and pushed. The soft wood gave with a small splintering crack, and the door swung inward. Inside was dim. Inside smelled of cold stone and old smoke. But inside was not the ruin she had braced for. Yes, there was dust, a film of it on the table, on the shelves, on the rough plank floor. But it was the dust of a season, not of half a century. And there, on the floor, crossing the gray, were footprints, not hers, bigger, a man's boot, coming in from the door, going to the fireplace, and back out again. Days old, maybe weeks. Marin stood very still in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her breath loud in the silence. She should have been afraid. A smart woman would have turned around, walked the 14 miles back, caught the bus, found another patch of wilderness to disappear into, one that did not come with a stranger's footprints in the dust. But Marin had spent her whole life learning to want what other people threw away, and she had walked 14 miles, over a 7,200-foot pass, with everything she owned on her back. She was not turning around. She stepped across the threshold, and the cabin closed around her like it had been waiting. It was a single large room, maybe 20 feet by 30, open to the rafters with a loft at one end reached by a wooden ladder. A stone fireplace dominated the west wall, its mantel a single dark beam worn smooth, beside it a cast-iron cook stove, rusted but whole. There was furniture left behind, a heavy wooden table in the center, 2 chairs pushed under it, a cot frame against the back wall, its canvas long rotted away, an empty bookshelf along the east wall, a small writing desk beneath one of the front windows set to catch the morning light, a coat rack by the door, 3 iron hooks, everything muted under that thin gray film, but everything intact. And then she saw the cabinet. In the corner, beside the bookshelf, gray steel, about 4 feet tall, the kind the Forest Service used to issue for storing maps and records, 2 doors, a built-in lock, a faded inventory number stamped on the front, and the doors were closed. Marin walked to it, tried the handle, locked. She looked around the room, at the door she had come through, at the coat rack beside it, at the 3 iron hooks, and then she looked up. Above the door, hanging from a small nail, a metal ring with 3 keys on it, 2 of them old skeleton keys, the kind that fit a door from another century, and the third, small, steel, the kind that fits a filing cabinet. She took the ring down. The metal was cold in her palm. She crossed the room, and she fit the small steel key into the lock. It turned. The lock clicked open, and Marin stood there, her hand on the handle, the key still turned, her heart going like a hammer, because she did not know what was inside, because she did not know what Elias Crane had left behind when he walked out of this cabin 53 years ago and disappeared into the snow, because somewhere a man's fresh footprints crossed the floor behind her, and she still did not know whose they were, but she was about to find out. She pulled the doors open, and inside was a treasure. Maps, hundreds of them, stacked in neat piles, organized by region, each one folded carefully along its original creases. Topographic surveys, fire boundary maps, hand-drawn routes on yellowed paper, marked in faded pencil by a hand that was careful and precise and gone. Marin reached out and touched the edge of the nearest stack. The paper was old, but sound, protected from the moisture and the cold by the sealed steel of the cabinet, while everything else in the cabin had aged around it. She pulled out the top map, unfolded it, a geological survey from 1934, original printing, the kind collectors paid hundreds of dollars for, the kind that belonged in a museum, not in an abandoned cabin 14 miles from the nearest road. She put it back, and that was when her hand brushed something that was not paper, something soft, something heavy. She pushed the last stack of maps aside, and on the bottom shelf, tucked behind them, were 3 canvas bags, each one tied with twine, the knots tight and deliberate, placed there with care, hidden behind the maps, as if whoever left them wanted them found only by a person patient enough to look through everything else first. Marin lifted the first one. It was heavy, much heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor, knelt in the dust, and worked the knot loose with cold fingers. The bag opened. Inside was money, old paper money, 20s and 50s bound in stacks with paper bands the way banks used to wrap it, and each stack was labeled with a year, written in the same neat, careful hand she had seen on the maps. 1964. Marin did not touch it, did not count it. She just looked. Then she opened the second bag. More money, more stacks, more years. 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, and the third was the same. 1969, 1970, 1971. She sat back on her heels in the fading light and looked at the 3 open bags spread on the floor in front of her. The bills were old, their colors soft, their edges worn, but they were real. They were a fortune, sitting in canvas bags in an abandoned cabin that she had bought for $10. She began to count. It took her nearly an hour. The light died as she worked, the sun dropping behind the western ridge, the cabin filling with shadow. She did not stop to light a candle. She just counted stack by stack, year by year, keeping the running total in her head. When she finished, she leaned back against the wall. Almost $40,000. 13 years of a man's savings, converted into paper, tied with twine, locked in steel, and left behind when he walked out of this cabin for the last time. She did not understand. Why would anyone leave $40,000 in an abandoned building? Why would Elias Crane not take his money when he left unless? The thought arrived cold and quiet, unless he had never planned to leave at all. And then she saw the portfolio at the very back of the cabinet, behind where the bags had been. She had missed it in the shadow. Dark brown leather cracked with age, tied with a leather cord. She drew it out, untied it, opened the cover. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter, typed on Forest Service letterhead, dated June 30th, 1971. Marin carried it to the window where the last gray light still came through, and she read, "To the next person who finds this cabin, my name is Elias Crane. I have been the district ranger of this station since 1958 when I was 27 years old. For 13 years, this cabin has been my home, and these mountains have been my whole responsibility, and I have loved this country with the kind of love that does not require explanation. The service is closing the station next month. They have offered me a desk in town. I have declined. The paperwork will say that I am moving to Alaska. That is what the official record will show, but I do not know if I will ever leave these mountains. I have thought a long time about what it means to love a place so deeply you cannot imagine yourself existing apart from it, and I have decided that I will not be the one to make the final choice. I will let the mountains decide, the way I have trusted them for 13 years. Over the years, I saved a little of each paycheck in cash and kept it here with the maps. I never spent much. The cabin was free. The food was mostly what I caught or grew. The money simply accumulated, and I am leaving it here, not for the service. They decided this place was no longer worth their attention, and I will not reward that decision with my savings. I am leaving it for whoever finds this cabin next. Anyone who walks 14 miles to get here and who opens this cabinet with the key I have left hanging by the door has earned the right to whatever I have left behind. I will not be the one to say who that is. I will trust the mountains to choose the way they have always chosen for me. Take care of the cabin if you can. There is one more thing I must set down, and I have put off writing it longer than anything else in my life. I have a daughter. I have never met her. I gave her up before I came to these mountains to a good family in Spokane who could give her what I could not. I have thought of her every single day for 13 years. I do not know her name. I do not know her face. But I have hoped in the foolish way a man hopes that some thread of me reached her anyway, that she grew up loving wild places, that she looks at maps and wonders what is beyond the edge of them. If you are reading this and you are a stranger, then keep the money and forget these last words. But if you are reading this and you feel something turn over in your chest that you cannot explain, then I think the mountains have chosen better than I ever could have hoped. Elias Crane, June 30th, 1971. Maren read it once, and then she read it again. And the cabin was very quiet around her, and the light was almost gone, and somewhere outside, far off, the raven called one more time across the darkening valley. A daughter, in Spokane, given to a good family before he came to the mountains, a child raised by someone else who might have grown up and had a child of her own, and that child another. A line of women stretching down the years until it reached a girl who could not sit still, a girl who finished her homework in 15 minutes and stared out the window, a girl who sat on a kitchen floor with an old road atlas in her lap, an atlas that smelled of dust and gasoline and something faintly sweet she could never name, an atlas that had belonged to a grandfather, a man she had never met, a man nobody ever talked about. Maren's hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. She set the letter down on the table, very carefully, as if it might break, and she whispered to the empty cabin, to the dark, to the ghost of a man she had never known, "That's not possible." But the mountains did not answer. They never do. They only wait. And outside, the first star came out over the eastern ridge, and the wind moved through the lodgepole pines, and somewhere down the trail in the falling dark, a pair of fresh boot prints waited to be explained. Because somebody had been caring for this cabin, because somebody had made a promise a long, long time ago, and Maren Voss had just walked straight into the middle of it. She did not sleep that first night. She lay on the floor of the cabin in her sleeping bag, the letter folded back in its leather portfolio on the table above her, and she stared up at the rafters in the dark and listened to her own heart refuse to slow down, because a daughter in Spokane meant nothing, because Spokane was a city of 200,000 people, because a grandfather she never met was just a grandfather she never met. Plenty of people had those, because the atlas, the old soft atlas that smelled of dust and gasoline, could have come from anywhere, a yard sale, a dead neighbor, a box at a thrift store, except her mother had never once explained where it came from, had never once said his name, had gone quiet and strange every single time Maren asked. "Stop it," Maren told herself. "Just stop. You are a tired woman in a cold cabin reading a dead man's letter and inventing a fairy tale because you are lonely. That is all this is." But the thought would not lie down. It paced the inside of her skull all night long, back and forth, across the floor, the way a stranger's boots had paced this very floor not long before her. And in the morning, she had a more immediate problem, because she woke to the smell of wood smoke, and she had not lit a fire. Maren sat up fast, heart slamming. The light through the dirty windows was gray and thin, dawn barely. And there it was, drifting under the door, the unmistakable smell of burning pine. She was out of the bag and across the room in 3 steps. She did not grab a knife because she did not have one worth grabbing. She grabbed the cast iron poker from beside the cook stove, and she eased the door open. A man stood in the clearing, older, tall, white beard, a green Forest Service jacket faded almost to gray. He had built a small fire in a ring of blackened stones a little ways off from the porch, and he was crouched beside it feeding it sticks like he had done it 1,000 mornings before. Maren knew him. "Walt," she said. Walt Brennan did not turn around. "Mornin'," he said, to the fire. "You drove me to the trailhead." "I did." "And then you walked 14 miles, up here, in the dark." "I did." Maren stood on the porch with a fireplace poker in her fist and tried to make any of it make sense. "The footprints," she said, "in the dust. Those are yours." Walt fed another stick to the flames. "They are. The woodpile, the swept porch, mine too." For how long? And now he did turn, slow, and he looked up at her with those wet old eyes that gave nothing away. 53 years, he said. The fire popped. A raven called somewhere up the ridge, and Maren came down off the porch and sat on a stump across the fire from him, because her legs did not feel like holding her up anymore, and she set the poker down in the dirt, because she understood suddenly that she did not need it. "Talk," she said. So he talked. "I was 12, Walt said. Summer of 62, my daddy took me up into this country to hunt elk, and we got separated in a fog bank near the pass. I went the wrong way, walked 2 days into the wrong drainage. By the time anybody found me, I was half froze and out of my head." He stared into the flames. "It was Elias Crane that found me, carried me 4 miles on his back, built a fire, kept me alive till the others came, sat with me all night, and never once let me see he was scared, even though I know now he must have been. A boy can die fast up here. We both knew it." Maren said nothing. "I asked him before they took me down. I asked him why he lived all the way out here alone. And you know what he said to me?" "What?" "He said, some men aren't built for staying, so they find the one place that'll keep them anyway." And the words went through Maren like cold water, because her mother had said the exact same thing about her father. Some people aren't built for staying. She had heard that sentence her whole childhood, from the only person who ever explained the man who left. And here it was again, out of the mouth of a dead ranger, through the mouth of an old man by a fire. 60-some years later. "Walt," she said carefully, "and his daughter, in Spokane. You knew about her." Walt went very still. "How do you know about that?" She did not answer. She just nodded toward the cabin, toward the table, toward the letter, and Walt closed his eyes. "He told me once," he said, near the end, the last fall before he went, he'd had a little too much of his own coffee and a little too much silence, I think. He said he'd given up a baby girl before he ever came to these mountains, said it was the right thing and the worst thing he ever did, both at once, said he never even held her. Did he ever try to find her? No. Walt's voice was rough. He said a man who couldn't stay had no business showing up in a child's life just to leave again. He said the kindest thing he could do was let her have a real family, one that wouldn't disappear. Maren stared at the fire, and inside her a wall she had built when she was 4 years old, a wall against a father who had vanished and a mother who would not speak of him. That wall made a small terrible sound, like ice beginning to crack. Because what if? What if the story she had told herself her whole life was wrong? What if it went back further than she ever knew? "Stop," she told herself. "You don't know anything. You have a letter and a feeling and an old man's memory. That is not proof. That is grief wearing a costume. You kept this place up for 53 years, she said, changing the subject because her chest could not hold the other one. Why? Walt shrugged, like it was the simplest thing in the world. He kept me alive when I was 12. Seemed like the least I could do was keep his house standing. He poked the fire. And I always figured somebody'd come. He said the mountains would choose. I believed him. I just didn't think it'd take this long." He looked at her then, really looked. "And I gotta tell you, girl, the first time I saw you get out of my truck and shoulder that pack without touching the straps, something went down my spine, because that's how he carried his. Exact same, like the weight was just part of him. Marin did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not sound insane. Anyway, Walt stood. His knees cracked. Woods split for you through summer. Springs behind the Turtle Rock 200 feet north, never runs dry. The west window sticks in damp weather. You push the upper left corner while you lift. He recited it like a prayer he'd said many times. He left instructions. In the letter, you read them. Not all of them. I stopped at the part about his daughter. Walt nodded slow. Read the rest, he said, when you're ready. And then he hitched up his pack, and he started down the trail, and Marin watched him go, an old man walking 14 miles home through the trees because a stranger had finally come to a house he'd guarded half his life. Walt, she called. He stopped. Will you come back? And the old man smiled, the first smile she had seen on him. Honey, he said, I've been coming back to this mountain for 53 years. I'm not going to stop now that there's finally somebody up here worth the walk. And then he was gone into the trees. The weeks that followed, Marin made the cabin hers. She scrubbed the floors on her knees with water hauled from the Turtle Rock spring. She scraped the grime off the windows. She swept out the cobwebs and the mouse droppings and 53 winters of dust. She repacked the chinking in the worst gaps between the logs with mud and grass. She cleaned the cook stove, lit her first fire on the third night with Walt's split lodge pole, and it caught hot and bright and the cabin filled with warmth and light and the smell of wood smoke. And she sat in one of the old chairs and watched the flames and thought about a man carrying a frozen boy 4 miles on his back. She inventoried the maps carefully. Each one unfolded, checked, dated, refolded. Most were valuable. A few were extraordinary. And in June, she mailed photographs of 6 of them to a dealer in Boise. He wrote back with an offer, $11,000. She took it. The cashier's check came care of the general store in Stanley. She opened a small account at a small bank where nobody asked questions about a young woman with dirt under her nails and wood smoke in her hair. She did not touch the canvas bag money because that money felt like it belonged to a conversation she was not finished having yet. She bought a small solar panel, a radio, books, so many books. She carried them up 14 miles on her back, volume by volume, and built a library on the empty shelf along the east wall. And every 2 weeks she walked down to Stanley for supplies. And every 2 weeks Della Hayes had a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake waiting for her without being asked. And every 2 weeks Marin almost asked her, almost said, Della, the thing he told you about the little girl in Spokane. Tell me again, tell me every word. And every 2 weeks she did not, because she was afraid of the answer, because some doors, once you open them, you cannot close again. It was in July that she found the journal. She had been repointing the fireplace, following Walt's instructions, mixing creek sand and cement, working the mortar into the gaps between the stones where 50 years of fire had crumbled it away. And one stone, low, on the left side of the firebox, moved, just slightly, under her hand. Marin stopped. She set down her trowel, and she worked her fingers around the edge of that stone, and it came free, the whole thing, a flat creek stone the size of a dinner plate, and behind it was a hollow, cut deliberately into the masonry, a hiding place, and inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. Her hands were not steady as she drew it out, unwrapped it, a leather-bound journal, the cover stiff with age, the pages soft and yellow, and on the first page, in that same careful hand, the private journal of Elias Crane, not for the service, not for anyone, just for me and for the mountains, and for whatever comes after. Marin sat down right there on the cold hearth with the journal in her lap, and she began to read, and what she read broke the last of the wall inside her brick by brick by brick, because the journal was not the letter. The letter had been a public thing, a thing meant to be found, composed, careful, A man putting on his best face for a stranger. The journal was the truth, and the truth was that Elias Crane was a man drowning in a love he could not deliver. He wrote about her constantly. The daughter. He did not know her name, so he gave her one. He called her June. After the month he'd signed the papers. June, who would be 6 now. June, who would be 10 now. June, who I imagine has her mother's hands and my stubbornness, and God help her if she has both. He wrote about driving down to Spokane once, in 1964, parking across the street from a school at recess, watching a yard full of children he could not tell apart, trying to guess which one was his, and failing, and driving 14 hours back to the mountains and never trying again. Because what right did I have? A man who gives a child away does not get to come back and look at her through a fence like a thief. He wrote a list of things he wished he could teach her: how to read a topo map, how to filter water from a stream, how to tell the berry that feeds you from the one that kills you, how to start a fire in the rain, how to find her way by the stars when the trail disappears under snow. Maren read that list with the journal shaking in her hands because it was her list. It was the exact list of things she had taught herself, alone, at 14, with nobody to show her, every single one. And she heard her own voice come out of her mouth in the empty cabin, small and cracked, and not at all like her. No, because this is not happening, because the odds are, they have to be, millions to 1, because lots of people learn to read maps, Maren. Lots of people. It is not a sign. It is not a message. It is a coincidence, and you are a grieving girl in the woods making a dead stranger into the family you never had. Stop it. Stop it. But her own voice in her head was getting harder to believe. She turned to the last entry, dated December 1971. The service closes me out next week. They want me in Salmon behind a desk, filling out forms about timber sales. I would rather walk into these mountains and never come back. I think I mean that more than a man should. I have not been well. I have not told anyone. There is a pain low in my gut that has been getting worse since the spring, and I know what my own father died of, and I know the shape of the thing that's growing in me. I will not go down the mountain to be poked and prodded and told I have 6 weeks. I would rather let these mountains keep me than spend my last days in a hospital bed in a town. I have made my arrangements. The money is in the cabinet for whoever comes. The letter is written, and there is a place I have chosen, up past the lookout tower on the little flat shelf of ground where the first sun hits in the morning. I dug it myself this fall when I still had the strength. It faces south. It faces the whole valley. When the time comes, I will go up there and I will lie down under the open sky, and I will let this country I have loved for 13 years do the last gentle thing it can do for me. I am not afraid. I only have one regret, and you know what it is, because I have written her name on every page of this book. June, if by some miracle a thread of me ever reaches you, if you are ever standing in these mountains, know that I did not leave you because I did not love you. I left you because I loved you more than I trusted myself to stay. Some men aren't built for staying, but God, how I wanted to. The entry ended there. There were no more pages, and Maren Voss sat on a cold stone hearth in a cabin 14 miles from the nearest road, holding a dead man's heart in her 2 hands, and she wept like she had not wept since the hospital room, since the exhale with no inhale after it, because she did not know, not for certain. She still did not know, but she knew where he was, past the lookout tower, on the little flat shelf of ground where the first sun hit in the morning, facing south, facing the whole valley. For 53 years, the search parties had looked everywhere, and he had been right here the whole time, a 2-minute walk from his own front door. She wanted to go find the place that very afternoon, but she didn't, because she was not ready, because once she walked up there and stood over that south-facing ground, The thing she suspected would stop being a beautiful aching maybe, and it would become a fact, one way or the other. And she was not ready for it to be a fact. So she wrapped the journal back in its oilcloth, but she did not put it behind the stone. She put it on the shelf beside her own journal where she could see it, where it could see her, and she let the summer carry her, and the summer was good to her. She fixed the things the cabin needed fixing. She climbed the lookout tower most evenings and sat in the old chair and looked at 80 miles of mountains, and she felt for the first time in her whole life like a person standing exactly where she was supposed to be standing. Visitors came that summer, a retired professor surveying mushrooms, a through hiker, 2 young men retracing their grandfather's old hunting route. They came with questions. What was it like out here? How did she survive? Wasn't she lonely? She told them it was quiet. She told them it was hard. She told them that being alone and being lonely were 2 different animals, and she only kept the one. She did not tell any of them about the money. She did not tell any of them about the journal. Some things were not for sharing. And then winter came, early that year. The first real snow fell in the 3rd week of October. Maren woke in the dark before dawn to a silence, so complete it had a texture, and she opened the door and stepped out in her wool socks and her long underwear, and the world had been remade. 6 inches of fresh white weighing the pine boughs down, softening every edge, turning the meadow into a clean blank page. And she felt joy, pure and strange and total, because this was the test. This was the part she had spent her whole life getting ready for. The hard months, the cut-off months, the months when she would depend on nothing but herself and the wood she'd split and the food she'd hauled. She had prepared. The woodshed was full. The pantry was stocked. The cabin was caulked and chinked and ready. She thought she was ready. She was wrong, because nothing prepares you for 30 below. In January, the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks. The air hurt to breathe. The snow squeaked under her boots like packed foam. The trees cracked and boomed in the night as the sap inside them froze and split the wood. She kept the fire going around the clock, woke every few hours to feed it, dressed in layers even inside because the corners of the cabin never got warm, no matter how the stove roared. And the silence pressed in on her, the deep, total silence of a world that had stopped moving. Some days she did not speak a single word out loud, so she started talking to the journal. She would read Elias an entry from his own book, and then she would answer it out loud into the dark. "I taught myself the stars too," she told him one night. "Nobody showed me. I just lay out in the orchard with a library book and figured it out." The fire popped. The wind moaned in the chimney. "I think you'd have liked me," she said. "I think we'd have argued about everything, and I think I'd have liked that too." And she knew it was crazy. She knew. A grown woman talking to a notebook in an empty cabin in the dead of winter. If anyone could see her, if Della could see her, if her mother could see her, but there was no one to see her. There was only the fire and the dark and the wind, and then came the worst night of her life. She woke choking, not from cold, from smoke, thick, gray, wrong, not the good clean wood smoke she had grown to love. This was acrid. This was poison. It rolled across the ceiling and blotted out the candle, and crawled down into her lungs like a living thing. The chimney was blocked. She knew it the second she understood she was awake. A clump of snow on the cap melted and refrozen into a plug. The fire still burning. The smoke with nowhere to go. Backing up, filling the room, filling her. She rolled off the cot and hit the floor, and that saved her life, because the cleanest air was low. She crawled to the stove, slammed the damper shut. The flames died down, but the smoke kept coming, billowing from every seam. She had to get out. She crawled to the door, got it open, and the night came in like a knife. 30 below. It froze the tears on her face and turned the wet in her nose to ice in a single breath. But it was clean. She stood on the porch, gasping, in her pajamas, in untied boots, and she looked back at the cabin, pouring smoke from every crack lit from within by the dull red of a dying fire, and one thought arrived, cold and clear and absolute. If you had not woken up, you would be dead. You would have died in your sleep, 14 miles from the nearest road, and no one would have found you until the snow melted in June. And the thought did not frighten her. It clarified her, because she was not going to die. Not tonight, not like this. She was going to fix it. She went to the woodshed, threw snow up to her thighs, and found the long metal pole she'd used to clean the chimney in the fall. She carried it back, climbed onto the porch rail, and from the rail onto the roof. The roof was ice, sloped, lethal in the dark. She moved on her hands and knees, jamming the pole into the snow for an anchor, sliding 1 foot at a time. Her fingers had already stopped feeling like fingers. Her bootlaces dragged loose behind her. She reached the chimney, and she saw it. A fist of ice clamped over the cap, sealed solid by meltwater that had frozen around the edges. She raised the pole, and she swung. The shock jarred up her arms. The ice cracked. She swung again, and again, and again. Chunks of ice spun off into the dark. The cap came loose. She knocked it aside and rammed the pole down into the flue, breaking apart whatever was choking it, and a column of trapped smoke roared up past her into the night. And below her, inside the cabin, she heard the fire catch its breath and come back to life as the air finally moved. She climbed down. She did not remember climbing down. She got back inside. The smoke was already clearing, pulled up the open flue. She built the fire high, and she sat in front of it, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and she shook, not from the cold, from how close it had been. And in the firelight she looked across the room at the shelf, at the oilcloth bundle, at a man who had walked up past the lookout tower into the snow because he would rather these mountains keep him than spend his last days in a hospital bed. "I get it now," she said to him, through chattering teeth. "I understand you now. This place, it doesn't love you back. It would not have mourned me tonight. It doesn't care if I live or die." The fire cracked. "But I love it anyway," she said. "I love it anyway. Is that what you meant? Is that the whole thing? You love it because it's worthy of love, not because it loves you back." And the cabin held its silence, and somehow that silence felt like an answer. She survived the rest of that winter, barely, thinner, harder, older in a way that did not show on the skin. And in April the snow began to let go, inch by inch, retreating up the slopes, the creek breaking free of its ice, the first birds coming back to fill the mornings, and Maren came out of that cabin like a woman coming out of a long sickness, pale, lean, alive. She had survived. She had passed the test, and she knew now that it was finally time to walk up past the lookout tower to the south-facing shelf, to find out for certain what she had spent the whole long winter afraid to know. But she never got the chance to go alone, because on a warm morning in early May, with the meadow just starting to green and the glacier lilies pushing up through the last of the snow, Maren heard something she had not heard in 7 months. A voice calling up from the trail, a woman's voice, old, thin, carried thin on the mountain air. "Hello, hello, the cabin." Maren came out onto the porch, and at the edge of the clearing, leaning hard on a carved walking stick, having somehow climbed 14 miles and a 7,200-foot pass on legs that had to be 80 years old, stood a tiny white-haired woman in a red wool coat. She had a canvas satchel over one shoulder, and she was staring at Maren like she was seeing a ghost. "Oh," the old woman breathed, one hand rising to her own mouth. "Oh, my lord, you have his eyes." Maren's heart stopped. "Who are you?" she managed, and the old woman steadied herself on her stick, and she lifted her chin, and the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. My name is Ruth Crane, she said. Elias Crane was my brother, and I have been looking for what he left on this mountain for 53 years. Ruth Crane sat at the heavy wooden table where her brother had once sat, and she would not let go of Marin's hand. She had Elias's eyes. That much was plain, pale gray-blue, the color of granite in shadow, the same eyes Marin saw in the mirror every morning and had spent her whole life assuming came from nowhere. 53 years, Marin said. How did you find this place now? A newspaper. Ruth's voice trembled, but it held. A little weekly out of Stanley. My great-niece sends me clippings. There was a story about a young woman living alone in the old Crane station. Della, Marin whispered. Della sent it. Because of course she had. Because Della Hayes had carried Elias Crane in her heart for 53 years too. And when a girl with his exact way of shouldering a pack walked into her diner, some old instinct in her had reached for the one thread that might tie a knot. I have been looking for my brother since the winter of 1971, Ruth said. The service told us Alaska. Then they told us he never arrived. Then they told us nothing at all. My parents died not knowing. I am the last one left who remembers him alive. She opened the canvas satchel, and she took out a photo album, soft brown leather, older than Marin. I brought him with me, Ruth said simply, in case there was anything left of him up here at all. She did not yet know how much. Marin stood, crossed to the shelf, and she took down the oilcloth bundle, and she set it on the table in front of the old woman very gently, the way you set down a sleeping child. There's a lot left of him, she said. Ruth, there's so much of him left. And she unwrapped the journal. Ruth Crane put one hand over her mouth. That's his hand, she breathed. That's Eli's hand. I'd know it anywhere. She did not read it yet. She could not. Her hands were shaking too hard. So Marin made coffee on the old stove, and she sat across from the old woman, and she told her everything, the $10 listing, the 14-mile walk, the cabinet, the money, the letter, Walt Brennan and his promise, and the journal, and the daughter named June who was never named June at all. And when she got to the daughter, Ruth set down her coffee. He gave up a child, Ruth said. It was not a question. Before the mountains, I knew. I'm the only one who knew. There was a girl he loved in '56 in Spokane. She died having the baby. And Eli was 25 and broken, and he believed God help him. He believed a child deserved better than a grieving man who couldn't sit still in one place. What happened to the baby? He gave her to a family, a good family. He made me promise never to look. He said a clean break was the only kindness. Ruth's eyes filled. He said, some people aren't built for staying, so the least they can do is not make a child watch them go. And Marin had to put both hands flat on the table, because there it was again, that sentence, the sentence her mother had said, the sentence Walt had quoted, the sentence Elias had written in his own book, said by people who had never met, across 3 generations, like a song handed down a bloodline that did not even know it was singing. Ruth, Marin said, and her voice did not sound like her own. What was the family's name, the family in Spokane, the one he gave the baby to? Ruth wiped her eyes. I told you, he made me promise not to look. But you looked anyway. Marin leaned forward. You've been searching 53 years. You looked for him. Tell me you looked for her too. Tell me, Ruth. And the old woman went very still, and then she reached back into the satchel with a hand that shook so hard the paper rattled, and she drew out a single yellowed envelope. I never opened it, Ruth whispered. I wrote down the name the day he told me. In '56, I sealed it in this envelope, and I swore I'd never look unless one day there was a reason. She slid it across the table. I think today might be the reason. Marin did not move, because once she opened it, she would know, and she had spent the whole winter afraid to know. Open it, she told herself. You walked 14 miles for this, and you didn't even know it. You've been walking toward this your whole life. The atlas, the maps, the stars you taught yourself in an orchard with a library book. Open it. She broke the seal. She unfolded the paper. One line, in a young man's handwriting, Elias Crane, 68 years gone from the page. The baby, a girl, given to Thomas and Adele Voss of Spokane. They will call her Margaret. May she never know the man who couldn't keep her. Margaret. The room went white at the edges because Thomas and Adele Voss were her great-grandparents, because the baby they raised, the girl they named Margaret, was Marin's grandmother, and Margaret had raised a daughter named Lorna, and Lorna had raised Marin. Margaret was the baby. Margaret was the daughter Elias had given away in 1956, the motherless infant he had handed to a good family so she would have a chance at the staying he could not give her. Voss. The name Marin had carried her whole life, the name on her mother's gravestone, the name she had always assumed was just a name. It was his choosing. It was the family a heartbroken man had picked in 1956 so his child would be safe. Marin Voss was Elias Crane's great-granddaughter. The mountains had not chosen a stranger. The mountains had called her home. Oh, Ruth Crane said, very softly, reading Marin's face because Marin could not say a single word. Oh, child, oh, my girl, you're ours. You were ours the whole time. And Marin Voss put her head down on her great-grandfather's table, and she wept. For her mother, who had never known whose blood she carried. For her grandmother, Margaret, raised by strangers who loved her never knowing she had been given away by a man who loved her more. For a great-grandfather who had watched children through a fence and could not pick out his own. For a man who had loved her across 53 years and the whole length of death, and had left her $40,000 and a cabin and a letter that ended with a riddle she had finally solved. If you are reading this and you feel something turn over in your chest that you cannot explain, then I think the mountains have chosen better than I ever could have hoped. She had felt it, that very first night, the cold stone turning over in her stomach at the word Spokane. It had been him, reaching across everything, saying, "There you are. I knew a thread of me would find you. I always hoped," and it had. They did not speak for a long time. Two women, one old, one young, holding hands across a table in a cabin 14 miles from the nearest road, while the May light moved across the floor. Then Ruth said the thing they had both been circling. "Where is he?" And Marin wiped her face, and she stood. "I know exactly where he is," she said. "He told me, in the journal. I've been afraid to go up there alone for 7 months." She looked at the old woman. "Will you come with me to find your brother?" And Ruth Crane, 80-some years old, who had climbed a 7,200-foot pass on a carved walking stick because a newspaper clipping had given her one last reason to hope, rose to her feet without a word and took Marin's arm and said, "I have been waiting 53 years to bring my brother home. Lead the way." They walked up past the lookout tower. Slow, Ruth's hand tight on Marin's arm, the walking stick finding each root and stone, past the tower's leaning legs, up a gentle rise through the lodge pole to a small flat shelf of ground, south-facing, the first place the sun would touch each morning. The whole valley spread out below it like an offering, and there, half sunk into the earth, softened by 53 winters of snow and pine duff and new growth, was a low mound of creek stones, not natural, placed. A man's last act of order in a life built entirely of order. He had carried each stone himself in the fall when he still had the strength. He had laid them over the place he had dug, and then when his time came, he had walked up here and lain down beneath the open sky and let the mountains he loved more than his own life finally gently keep him. He had not been lost. He had gone home. And At the head of the mound, leaning against a flat stone, scoured almost smooth by half a century of weather, but still legible if you knelt and ran your fingers over it, was a carving. 3 letters and a year, EC 1971. Ruth Crane sank down beside her brother's grave, and she laid one ancient trembling hand flat on the cold stones, as if she could still feel a heartbeat through 53 years of rock and earth. "There you are," she whispered. "Oh, Eli, there you are. We looked everywhere, and you were home the whole time." And Marin knelt on the other side, and she put her hand down next to Ruth's, and for the first time in her entire life, Marin Voss touched her family, the whole family, the mother in the hospital bed, the grandmother named Margaret, the great-grandparents she'd never thought to question, the man under the stones who had taught her every survival skill she owned without ever once being in the same room. All of it, one bloodline, one ache, one stubborn, wandering, mountain-loving heart, beating down through the generations until it landed in a girl on a kitchen floor with an atlas in her lap, looking at where she was going to live someday. She had not been making it up. She had been remembering. They buried nothing new that day. There was nothing to bury. He had done it all himself. But Marin went back down and brought up the journal, and Ruth read aloud in the thin mountain air the last words her brother had ever written, about a daughter named June who was really named Margaret because he never let himself learn the name they gave her. And then Marin did something, quietly, without planning it. She took the pencil from her pocket, and on the flat headstone below EC 1971, in her own hand she added a line. His family came back. 2024. It took weeks to sort the rest. A historian came up that summer, a careful, kind man named Dr. Renner from the State University who had spent years on the missing rangers of the Sawtooth. Marin and Ruth showed him the journal and the grave, and he wept an old academic weeping in the wind, because some mysteries you study your whole career and never expect to actually solve. The county confirmed it in the end. The dental records from a yellowed Forest Service file, the whole official machinery grinding slowly toward the truth that 2 women had already known the moment they laid their hands on cold stone. Elias Crane was no longer missing. Elias Crane had come home, and Walt Brennan came up the mountain when he heard, and he stood over the grave he had walked past 14 miles, twice a season, for 53 years, never once knowing the man he'd been keeping faith with was lying 10 steps off the trail the whole time. "You old fool," Walt said to the stones, and his voice broke clean in half. "You were right here. You let me look for you for 53 years, and you were right here." And then he laughed, a wet, terrible, beautiful laugh. You always did want the last word. And the question came the way it always comes, from Ruth first, then from Dr. Renner, then gently from Della when Marin finally told her everything over a cheeseburger and a milkshake in the empty diner one warm evening. What now? $40,000, a cabin worth far more than $10 to the right buyer, a historic site, a piece of land that collectors and developers would line up to fight over. "Sell it," the world said. "You're 21, you're broke, you have nothing. Sell the cabin and the maps and walk into a normal life. You've earned it." And Marin thought about it. For one whole day she thought about it. Then she climbed the lookout tower at sunset, and she sat in her great-grandfather's chair, and she looked at 80 miles of mountains turning gold, and she heard his voice, out of his own book, clear as if he sat beside her. "I am leaving it for whoever finds this cabin next. Anyone who walks 14 miles to get here has earned the right to whatever I left behind." He had not built a fortune. He had built a door for the next person who had nowhere to go, the next person who couldn't sit still inside the lines, the next person the world had thrown away, who walked 14 miles into the wilderness looking for somewhere anything that nobody else wanted, the next person like her. And Maren Voss made her choice. She would not sell. She used the money, his money, her money, their money to make the cabin sound. A new roof on the woodshed, new windows in the lookout tower, a second cot, a bigger pantry, a guest book bound in leather set on the writing desk by the front window where the morning light came in, and she opened it, not as a business. There was no money in it and no money wanted. She opened it the way Elias had left it, as a place that chose people. Word spread the way it does in the backcountry, quiet, person to person, a bunk and a fire and a hot meal for anyone who could walk the 14 miles to find it. No questions, no applications, no credit checks. The through hiker who'd run out of food, the man back from a war who couldn't sleep in cities, the grieving widow who needed a winter alone with the silence, the runaway kid who needed to learn that being alone and being lonely were two different things. They came, they rested, they wrote in the leather book, and they went back down the mountain a little less thrown away than they'd come up, and every single one of them learned before they left how to read a topo map, how to filter water from a stream, how to tell the berry that feeds you from the one that kills you, how to start a fire in the rain, how to find their way by the stars. The list, his list, the things a man had wished he could teach a daughter he never met. Maren taught them to everyone now, so that no thread of him would ever be lost again. Ruth Crane stayed. She had a little house in Boise and a life 80-some years long behind her, and not much of it left ahead. And one evening in the cabin, with the fire going and the journal between them, she said it plain. "I'm too old for the climb, child. I won't make it up here many more times." "Then don't go down," Maren said. "Stay through the summer. Stay as long as your legs allow. There's a cot, there's a fire, there's family." And Ruth Crane looked at the girl with her brother's eyes, and something 53 years tight finally came loose in the old woman's chest. "I lost everyone," Ruth whispered. "My parents, my brother. I've been the last one for so long, I forgot what it felt like to belong to somebody." "You're not the last one," Maren said. "You never were. You just hadn't found me yet." And she took the old woman's hand. Two women, one old, one young, both worn down by the long arithmetic of loss, both having spent their whole lives believing they were alone in the way that matters most, and both of them wrong, because the mountains had been patient, the mountains had waited, the way they always wait, until the right two people climbed the same trail toward the same buried heart, and found at the top of it that they had been each other's family all along. In September, on an evening very much like the one that had brought her here, Maren climbed the lookout tower one more time. She climbed slow. She knew the loose rungs now, where to put her hands, where to put her feet. At the top, the windows were clean. She'd washed them that week. The chair faced west. The binoculars hung on their hook. And below, on the porch, she could see Ruth in her red wool coat, wrapped in a blanket, watching the same sunset. From a rocking chair Walt had hauled up the mountain board by board. Maren sat in her great-grandfather's chair, and she looked at 80 miles of mountains the way he had looked at them, the way someone would look at them 100 years from now. The aspens gold again, the peaks dusted white, a raven calling somewhere down the valley, the sound carrying impossibly far in the thin, clean air. She thought about her mother, Lorna, who had found a little girl on a kitchen floor with an atlas in her lap and thought it was a phase, who had died never knowing that the atlas she could not explain had belonged to her own grandfather, who had carried a wandering heart her whole life and never once gotten to know whose it was. Maren wished she could tell her, "Mom, it wasn't nothing. It was him, the whole time. It was where we came from." And maybe she thought, looking at the river of light beginning to rise over the eastern ridge, maybe Lorna knew now. Maybe the dead get to know the things the living spend their whole lives reaching for. She hoped so. She let herself hope so. That night she sat at the heavy wooden table, the fire crackling, Ruth asleep in the loft, the wind moving soft through the lodge pole outside, and she opened her own journal. She kept it on the shelf beside her great-grandfather's, now the two of them side by side, where each could keep watch over the other, and she wrote about the day, the visitors who'd come and gone, the light on the mountains, the old woman sleeping above her who had no one in the world and now had everyone. And then she wrote the only two lines that mattered. I am home. The mountains chose me, and it turns out they'd been choosing me all along. She closed the book. She banked the fire. She climbed into bed and pulled the blankets to her chin. Outside, the wind sang in the pines. The stars blazed in the cold dark. The lookout tower stood watch over the little cabin in the clearing, the cabin where a man had lived and loved and made his peace and come home, the cabin that would stand another 50 years, another 100, waiting for whoever the mountains chose next. And down past the tower on the south-facing shelf, where the first sun touched each morning, a low mound of creek stones rested under the open sky. No longer lost, no longer alone. His family had come back. The way he'd always hoped, a thread of him would find its way. And Maren Voss slept, and in her dreams she was 8 years old again, cross-legged on a kitchen floor, a worn road atlas open across her lap, tracing the green spaces with one small finger, looking at where she was going to live someday. Except now in the dream she was not alone on that floor. A man sat beside her, gray blue eyes, a careful quiet way about him, and he watched her trace the green spaces, and he did not smile and shake his head and call it a phase. He just leaned close and pointed to one small green square deep in the mountains of Idaho, and he said, "There, that one, that's where you're going. I'll be waiting." And the little girl looked up at the great-grandfather she had never met, and she said, "I know."